They never talk about the quiet ones. They never talk about the names that didn't make headlines, the ones who weren't banned, the ones who didn't cry on television, the ones who slipped through the cracks while cricket burned around them. When people talk about cricket corruption in the late 1990s, they mention the obvious names: big stars, loud scandals, courtrooms, and confessions. But corruption doesn't survive on celebrities alone. It survives in the background, in whispered approaches, in unanswered questions, in players who were there, close enough to see it, close enough to be named, but never close enough to be punished. And one of those names is Dougie Brown, a respected all-rounder, an England international, a Scotland captain, a man remembered by many as a hard-working cricketer who gave everything on the field, but also a man whose name surfaced in the same corruption-era reporting that exposed some of the darkest moments in cricket history. Not because he was banned, not because he confessed, but because he was approached. And in the world of cricket corruption, being approached is never a coincidence. Dougie Brown's career existed in an era when bookmakers did not knock once, they knocked repeatedly. They didn't care if you were a superstar or a squad player. They cared about access, information, vulnerability, and opportunity. They cared about moments, not medals. And during an ICC event in the late 1990s, an era now universally accepted as cricket's most corrupt, Dougie Brown was reported to have been approached by a bookmaker. His name appeared alongside Adam Hollyoake in corruption reporting, not in court verdicts, not in bans, but in records that show how deep the rot truly went. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the world Dougie Brown played in. This was not modern cricket with anti-corruption units, encrypted reporting systems, and integrity officers hovering near dressing rooms. This was an era where bookies moved freely through hotels, where fans had private access, where cash didn't leave digital trails, where silence was currency. Players were targeted not because they were criminals, but because they were human. Dougie Brown was not a megastar protected by layers of management. He was not untouchable. He was a working international cricketer navigating selection pressure, financial uncertainty, in a cricket system that offered far less protection than it pretended to offer. And that made him exactly the type of player bookmakers liked to approach. Reports from the corruption investigations of that era repeatedly show a pattern. Bookmakers didn't immediately ask players to fix matches. That would be reckless. They began with conversation, friendly gestures, compliments, access. Then came information requests, pitch conditions, team morale, weather, who was injured, who was nervous, who wasn't sleeping well. Information is the first gateway drug of corruption. Once a player gives information, even once, the boundary between honesty and compromise is crossed, and whether a player continues or pulls away, the damage is already done. Dougie Brown's name surfaced because an approach was made. That alone places him inside the corruption ecosystem of the era. It confirms that bookmakers saw value in him, access through him, influence near him. And cricket history tells us one uncomfortable truth: bookmakers do not waste time on people who are irrelevant. The late 1990s were not just chaotic, they were predatory. The ICC later admitted that corruption was far more widespread than officially recorded. Investigators acknowledged that many approaches went unreported, many names were never fully examined, and many cases were quietly closed without consequence. Being named in corruption reporting was often the only trace left behind. Dougie Brown was never formally charged, never banned, never publicly punished, but neither were dozens of others whose names appeared in the same documents, the same investigative conversations, the same whispered warnings. And that raises the question cricket has never answered properly. If he was approached, what happened next? Did he report it immediately? Did he ignore it? Did he walk away? Or did the system simply choose not to dig deeper? Because in the corruption era, justice was selective. Some players were sacrificed to save the image of the game. Others were quietly protected. Others existed in a gray zone where suspicion followed them, but consequences never did. Dougie Brown's case sits squarely in that gray zone, and that gray zone is where corruption thrives. What makes this more uncomfortable is the proximity of names. Adam Hollyoak, a player whose own career later became associated with controversy, appears in the same reporting context. These were not isolated incidents, they were clusters, networks, patterns. Corruption doesn't move randomly, it spreads socially. The ICC events of that era were prime hunting grounds. Players from different nations, less scrutiny, relaxed environments, and massive betting interest. Bookmakers didn't need to control entire matches, they only needed moments. One over, one no ball, one dropped catch, one slow start, and the player doesn't even have to be the one acting. Sometimes all that's needed is information passed quietly to the wrong person. This is why the phrase "approached by a bookie" should never be treated lightly, because an approach is a test of integrity, a test of fear, a test of silence. And cricket has never demanded public answers from everyone who faced that test. Dougie Brown went on to captain Scotland. He became a respected figure. He transitioned into coaching. He remained part of the cricket establishment. But the shadow of the corruption era never truly left. Not because he was proven guilty, but because the system that allowed the approach was never fully exposed. And that's the real story here. This is not about declaring guilt where none was proven. This is about exposing how deep corruption ran, how many players were touched by it, and how selective accountability protected the game's image rather than its integrity. If Dougie Brown was approached, how many others were never named? If reports mentioned him but no action followed, how many reports were quietly buried? If cricket truly cleaned itself up, why are these stories still incomplete? The late 1990s taught us that corruption doesn't always look like handcuffs and bans. Sometimes it looks like unanswered questions, careers that continue uninterrupted, and histories written carefully to avoid discomfort. Dougie Brown's name is part of that uncomfortable history, not as a proven villain, not as a convicted fixer, but as a reminder that cricket's corruption era was far bigger than the names we were allowed to focus on. And until cricket confronts every shadow, not just the convenient ones, the game will never fully escape its past. Because corruption doesn't disappear when you punish a few people. It disappears when you tell the whole truth. And the truth is this: being approached was never rare. Being exposed was.